You know, in this business, there are comedians, there are comics, and once in a while, rarely, somebody...
America had a late-night king, Johnny Carson, who ruled the national TV with a grin so charming you'd forget the time. Yet behind that smile was a secret list we should all know about. From Hollywood divas to comedians, Johnny Carson has had everybody on the set of his show. But there have also been thick tensions behind the curtains. Today, let's take a look at the 8 guests Johnny Carson hated the most. Number 1. Bob Hope. At the top of Johnny Carson's list of annoying people is Bob Hope. Although he was the entertainer of the century, ironically, he and the popular host could not get along. Yet Bob Hope was one of the most frequent guests on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. He was also the guest Johnny disliked most. For 25 years, Hope appeared well over 100 times on The Tonight Show. Whether Carson approved of his appearance or not, Bob Hope showed up on The Tonight Show as often as once every few months. On paper, they were a perfect match, 2 successful men with similar wit. They were notable figures in the comedy industry. Both had that cool detachment, that suave delivery. But the tension behind the scenes piled up to a point where the modest Johnny Carson began to hold a grudge. "Again?" Johnny had muttered one time behind the Cinerama studio door when NBC insisted that Hope needed some time for his latest special. Refusing him wasn't an option. Bob Hope was as important to NBC as Johnny Carson, so Carson was often forced to accommodate him. Later, when all of this was over, Peter LaSalle shared that Johnny admired Hope's place in show business. He was popular, known, and loved for his work. But Johnny Carson did not share their enthusiasm. Hope was known for a particular formula every time he appeared on Johnny Carson's show: his rituals. This bored Carson crazily because it robbed him of the spontaneity he lived for. Carson's wit sharpened in conversation. He loved improvising. He'd debate a silly point or follow an unexpected thread. Hope was the complete opposite of spontaneity. He was scripted, never did a riff intellectually. Carson's former co-head writer Andrew Nichols, in an interview, said that there was nothing spontaneous about Hope. He relied on his writers for every topic. But Johnny appreciated people who had an interest in the real world. There was nothing to talk to Bob about. After many years of dominating the comedy world while building a rivalry with Johnny Carson, Bob Hope's poor eyesight and fading hearing problem became a major concern both in his career and his sessions with Carson. Their conversations lagged because Hope would confuse questions, answer off script, and rely entirely on Carson's fold-out guide. One day, after a particularly awkward interview, Johnny fumed backstage, saying, "If I ever end up like that, guys, I want you to shoot me." Funny, right? Yet, despite all the grudges, Carson never cut him loose, at least not publicly. He respected his career despite his prejudice, and when things worsened, Carson never disrespected him on TV. In 1993, Johnny Carson accepted Hope's invitation for his 90th birthday. For the first time, Carson did a monologue. His gesture may have been out of courtesy, but the mere fact that he held respect for Bob Hope's legacy despite his grudges is the reason Bob Hope still holds respect in the industry. But as it is true of the arts, every entertainer has their audience. Hope, despite his shtick and cue card clarity, had a loyal fan base who adored him. Yes, he didn't do it like the rest of the world, but he was a man whose hard work gave him a place in the long list of world-class professionals. Carson liked a genuine back and forth. He thrived in conversations, and so communication between them was a little stiff. So while the audience cheered because Hope kept them happy, Johnny Carson privately loathed Hope's rehearsed appearances because they stifled his creativity. And as it usually turns out, there's only so much you can take from someone who suffocates you. Bob Hope turned out to be his least favorite. And that makes us wonder, how did Hope feel about all of this? He was only trying to make a name for himself by doing what he could do best. So why was he called dull? Let's move to the next person. Number 2, Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers was Johnny Carson's brightest pupil. She was a rising star with a quick wit and a fearless attitude that immediately dazzled audiences in her debut. It was 1965, on another of Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, Joan Rivers appeared to create a history that would turn sour over time. Her first appearance on the show was so electrifying that Carson proclaimed on air that she would be a star. From that moment, her career took off. Carson trained, corrected, and groomed her. Over the next 2 decades, Joan Rivers appeared nearly 100 times on the show, including nights she guest hosted. By 1983, Rivers recorded 100 episodes of The Tonight Show hosted by her. Soon, she became a television sensation. When Carson took vacations, Rivers was tapped to fill in his spot. Their on-screen rapport could have passed for a real-life friendship, but later, Rivers admitted that their friendship existed entirely on camera. When the cameras went off, they had nothing to say to each other. Yet Carson believed that Joan Rivers was a star in the making. He mentored her early career, helped refine her set, and gave her a platform when comedy was still an industry dominated by men. The real test came when Joan received an offer from Fox to host The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers, in 1986. The late-night program was supposed to air against Carson's territory. This became a sensitive situation. The show was offering Joan Rivers $10 million. It was historic. She would be the first female late-night host on a major network. Taking this job would immediately put an unspoken line between Carson and her. Carson later heard the news through industry channels that she had taken the job. When she finally called him, he slammed the phone down and cut all ties with her. Carson's reaction was swift and horrifying. Rivers became another name on his blacklist. Carson took it an inch further. NBC talent agencies were warned that whoever appeared on her show risked their chances of ever appearing on The Tonight Show. Jay Leno and Conan O'Brien respected the ban for decades. Joan would not return to television until February 2014, when Jimmy Fallon made her a guest. Almost 30 years after the drift, she made a second appearance, and conflicting opinions began over her disloyalty to Johnny Carson. Joan Rivers, after this experience, finally told her side of the story. She wrote that she'd feared the deal would collapse if Carson knew too soon. She wrote that Carson felt he owned her, hence, her departure felt like a betrayal to him. He just didn't like that as a woman. I went up against him. During an earlier interview, Joan Rivers confessed that the breakup had hurt her a lot, and she hadn't even realized it. On the other hand, Carson insisted that he was betrayed. Debate rooms on Reddit concluded that Carson must have considered Rivers as someone who would succeed him. She wasn't his competition, but someone he trusted and loved the show as much as he did. The only time Carson commented on Joan Rivers' new level, his words were, "I wish her the best." This perceived disloyalty must have originated from the very moment Carson began to mold Joan's career. Therefore, when Joan tried to stand on her own, she had to be taught a lesson. Her show collapsed after sober months. Her husband committed suicide in 1987, and Rivers lost her sanity. She said in those moments, she felt like Stalin had sent her to Siberia. When asked if Carson ever reached out, she smiled sadly. Their story is easily one of a mentorship turned defection, loyalty tested by ambition, and another tragic reminder that success can also come with a bitter price. Rivers seized an opportunity to create history for women in comedy, but in doing so, she challenged Johnny Carson, the man who had molded her career. 7 months later, Joan Rivers lost both the show and her mentor's friendship. What began as mutual respect and comedic chemistry ended in a hurtful silence and unforgivable actions of recklessness or maybe bravery. Number 3. Don Rickles. Don Rickles was nicknamed Mr. Warmth by Johnny Carson himself. The friendship began when audiences of The Tonight Show showed their admiration and love for Donald Rickles. He appeared over 100 times during Johnny Carson's era of comedy dominance. Just like Joan Rivers, he often stood in as guest host for Carson. But beneath the laughter and seemingly happy friendships was a complex love/hate dynamic. Rickles was abrasive, weaving insults into his humor and oftentimes striking a nerve with Carson himself. Don Rickles thrived on poking fun at everyone. Even the popular game show host, Ed McMahon, wasn't safe from Rickles' foul mouth. Don Rickles was so known for his insult-based formula that even his signature greeting, "Hello, dummy," was a crowd pleaser. Another of his famous jokes was the insults he frequently dished out about Carson's wealth. Carson made a good income of $50 million a year, and Don Rickles would often joke that Carson's folks were still in Nebraska eating locusts. Carson would laugh alongside the audience, but behind the scenes, that wasn't an approved joke, but it was bearable. The notorious clash that split them happened on a fateful December day in 1976. Carson was off for the day, and Rickles had sauntered into his office, slamming the iconic wooden cigarette box on Carson's desk to pieces. It may have been just another cigarette box to Johnny Carson, but that was an heirloom Carson had kept since 1967. The very next evening, when Carson returned, he noticed the broken box and exploded. He stormed into the adjacent CPO Sharkey set where Rickles was filming, camera and mic in hand. Carson walked in and confronted him on live TV, and in the process, called Rickles a big dummy. But that wasn't all. The highlight came when Johnny, according to reporters, playfully slapped Don Rickles. But audiences in both studios were not impressed. Rickles raked out an apology when Carson demanded compensation. "What are you going to do about this?" In an interview, Rickles would later admit that breaking the cigarette box was accidental, and Carson milked it a little bit. That sentence drew a line in their dynamic. Feud in the form of jest, but real enough to sting. Their relationship was a cycle of mutual respect and uncontrollable irritation. Carson valued Rickles' quick wit and enjoyed having him on the show. Workers behind the scenes said they were like sparring partners. They frequently teased each other as this kept their bond sharp and constant. Sometimes Rickles crossed personal lines, but Carson, being polite, never aired his displeasure until the wooden box incident, and that kept him in check. However, this never changed Carson's respect for Rickles. He frequently invited him to the show, and over time, he made about 100 impactful appearances that in 2012, Late Show host David Letterman named him one of the funniest late-night guests of all time. Rickles won an Emmy for his show title, Mr. Warmth, The Don Rickles Project. Carson himself contributed to this show, ensuring that Rickles' impact in late-night history was documented accurately. Yet the tension between them never fully subsided, only tolerated. Each night he appeared on The Tonight Show. He was careful not to cause any havoc, and Carson would blend the night with exceptional camaraderie. When all of this was over, critics and television experts applauded their on-screen chemistry, despite the underlying tension that existed. That Carson and Rickles put aside their prejudices brought about a new era of late-night spontaneity. Some fans argue the feud was showbiz gold, while others think Carson's reaction to the cigarette box went a bit too far, especially when he stormed across studios. Despite it all, that moment can be celebrated today as one of the greatest moments in late-night history. Number 4. Wayne Newton. When iconic Mr. Las Vegas Wayne Newton appeared on Johnny Carson's show, he found that it was not just a show, but the beginning of what was going to become a series of repeated jabs at his masculinity and sexuality. Newton had been a regular friendly face on The Tonight Show, appearing multiple times between the 1960s and the 1970s. Initially, he and Carson shared a mutual respect. Carson had welcomed him to the show with open arms. Still, the cracks started to appear when Carson began to mock Newton relentlessly, focusing particularly on his manliness and hinting at a different sexuality. These on-air jabs began to sting and grew sharper over time. Eventually, Newton got fed up but tried to handle things civilly at first. However, after he tried to reach Carson's manager, lawyer, and producer, but got no response, he decided to take things into his own hands. Beyond the jokes, their feud became more serious when Carson lost out on acquiring the Aladdin Hotel and Casino in 1980 because Newton's investment group had already won the bid. Carson could not hide his frustrations. Therefore, he publicly labeled Newton's bid a cutesy publicity stunt. Coincidentally, that same year, NBC aired reports suggesting that Newton had ties to organized crime. Newton had accused Carson of fueling those rumors through NBC's influence. But regardless of who fueled the rumors, the outcome was clear. Newton was never mentioned again on The Tonight Show, and the feud became a representation of Carson's punchy persona, especially how he handled situations when threatened. The fallout between them ruined their on-screen friendship. Newton went on to continue his Vegas empire and music career but never appeared on Carson's show again. Carson, on the other hand, gave no public explanation of what happened, and in the end, this was more than comedy gone wrong. It was a bruised ego gone public. And so their fractured dynamic left a lasting tension behind the laughter. Number 5. Dr. Paul Ehrlich. In 1970, Carson invited Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich, also the author of The Population Bomb, to The Tonight Show. This single appearance kicked off a unique recurring segment where Ehrlich made around 18 appearances over a decade. At first, Carson found Ehrlich fascinating. He was a witty, combative scholar who wasn't afraid to dive into grim projections on famine, pollution, and resource collapse. Their brief collaboration, however, was impactful. In just a matter of days after Ehrlich's debut episode, which generated thousands of letters, membership propelled from 600 to 60,000. and Ehrlich was immediately drawn to the spotlight of fame. But even then, their partnership wasn't without tension. Ehrlich's tone often conflicted with Carson's preferred late-night style. While his messages were scientifically intriguing, they were also emotionally draining for a comedic platform. When viewer reviews came in, they both admired Ehrlich's intellect but also rejected his bleak mood. And soon more voices arose on The Tonight Show, arguing that they were disrupting the lighthearted charm of the show. And so behind the scenes, trouble began to rise. Carson had reportedly remarked to Ehrlich, saying, "We're not the Discovery Channel." Although the line wasn't directly quoted, it effectively captured Carson's sentiment. At that point, it was apparent to everyone that Ehrlich's appearances had threatened to shift the tone Carson guarded on the show. However, it wasn't a straight condemnation. Although he saw himself more as an upbeat man, Carson respected Ehrlich's credentials and often offered him the stage repeatedly, and occasionally even stepped aside during a show to let Ehrlich do an uninterrupted monologue. However, Ehrlich's predictions didn't age well. His population bomb forecasted famine and disaster in the 1970s, yet the population nearly doubled while global hunger declined significantly. Critics later mocked him as a doomsday celebrity, suggesting his views were overblown, alarmist, and in some cases harmful. But just as he was mocked, Ehrlich's dedicated fans stood by him and raised awareness on ecological threats and population impact. However, the main tipping point came in the early 80s. By then, even Ehrlich's unpredictable segments on the show became repeated and dull, and began to weigh down the show's signature levity. Eventually, Ehrlich's segments were reduced and relegated to occasional documentaries and brief NBC News features, not the Tonight Show prime slot. Carson continued to maintain his respect on the show, but began to set limits for his next guests. Still, his legacy endures, and his voice has changed the conversations around certain discourse, from population policy to environmental limits and governmental responsibility. However, even when many of its dire predictions didn't come to pass, the population bomb sold 3 million copies and sparked debate worldwide. Carson's nuanced stance made the tension rather clear. While he admired Ehrlich's intellect, he fiercely protected his show's comedic identity. Although some parts of the audience may have disliked the alarmist tone, Ehrlich's appearances remain a fascinating chapter in late-night television. It carefully illustrates Carson's balancing act, where he can just as easily respect serious discourse while preserving his humor on the show, and a late-night legacy built on laughter first. Number 6. Madonna. For the legendary Madonna, her first visit to The Tonight Show on June 9, 1987, was nothing short of historic, but it was also far from comfortable. The reigning material girl, who had already sold over 30 million records, chose Carson for her talk show debut. But her boldness and attitude quickly changed things around the show's rhythm. She had arrived in a black lace bustier that shocked Carson, causing him to stammer, "What would I call that if I walked into a lingerie store?" His comment, although playful, made things a little tense on the stage, but the banter didn't stop there. At one point, Madonna told Carson that if she were going to present herself as a virgin to anyone, it should be him. Carson's polite laughter had a slight edge this time, becoming provocative and quite surprising. Yet, as the interview progressed, Madonna's flirtation turned into dismissive energy. She joked about Carson's hair mousse, swatted at a fly, teased him sexually, and even kissed him. By the end, Carson lowered his defenses and sighed, "You're a nice lady," to which Madonna replied coyly, "And you're not so bad yourself." Despite her soft words, her tone had unsettled him and the audience. Some viewers loved the shakeup. Still, the impact on late-night hosts was clear. Many saw her as rude or attention-hungry. The Los Angeles Times praised her but didn't comment on the NBC interview. Many critics claimed that the interview was uncomfortable, and that the studio reaction turned awkward and disrupted the rhythm of the show. When the show aired, NBC decided never to invite Madonna back. However, she later appeared on Jay Leno and Conan O'Brien's The Tonight Show in 1994, where she cursed 14 times and refused to leave the set of the show. But there's ambiguity here. Madonna was a trailblazer in sexual empowerment, pushing boundaries that resonated with younger audiences, and in that sense, she broke new ground. Yet in Carson's conservative era, her approach felt abrasive. even disrespectful. Ultimately, the interview was a clash of worlds, revealing the significant differences between the two media personalities. Carson's discomfort when she gave him a cheek kiss revealed the fault lines between their eras. And just like that, the defining pop icon of the 80s was never again seen on The Tonight Show. Number 7. Arnold Schwarzenegger. This guest was never among those that Johnny Carson disliked personally, but Schwarzenegger's imposing presence and promotional flair sometimes crossed an invisible line. To Carson, Arnold felt like a performance that was waiting to happen, a master showman who dominated the stage rather than engaging in on-air exchange. Their first encounter on The Tonight Show came in the late 1970s, years before Arnold's blockbuster movie, The Terminator, appeared on TV. Carson's guest host, David Brenner, had welcomed Arnold to the show to chat about bodybuilding and emerging Hollywood aspirations. The debut was amiable. Arnold spoke of his triumphs in Mr. Universe and Olympia, his bilingual charm, and also some of the early opportunities he had in the industry. By 1984, Carson turned to face Arnold head-on for the Terminator press run. During that performance, Arnold was filled with confidence as he spoke about his journey from bodybuilding to film with grace and joy. But his measured delivery and self-promotional tone quietly struck at Carson's sacred format. While Carson didn't mind powerful guests on his show, he expected the conversation to be a dialogue, not the monologue that Arnold turned it into. Behind the curtain, whispers circulated, and some of the staffers had a few opinions, saying that Arnold was too much show and not enough soul. Whether that was meant or not, it equally captured Carson's concern. The show was meant to showcase its guests, not let them steal it. Carson mostly thrived on unpredictability, on the guest revealing themselves in real time, not reading from a promotional playbook. But there was no public confrontation, and Arnold never reappeared as a guest on The Tonight Show again. Still, the mutual respect between the two of them remained, and that same year, Arnold admitted to CNN that he'd always admired Carson. However, there are still some conflict lines today. Many Arnold fans insist that his clear message style added substance, not just hype. Many critics now agree that Carson's editorial control was final, if it could easily take powerful guests off the show. In the end, there was no feud between the two of them, just divergence. Arnold went on to appear on other late-night stages with Leno, Letterman, Fallon, and even brought Carson's inspired bits to Fallon in 2015. They were two stars on parallel paths. One commanded attention with sheer persona, and the other fostered an intimate dialogue in the silence. Their meeting demonstrates Carson's support for talent as well as his expected respect for the craft. Number 8. Angie Dickinson. Angie Dickinson was celebrated for her charm and witty traits, which made her a favorite of The Tonight Show. But beneath the flirty banter and the playful smiles lay a subtle tension that unsettled Johnny Carson and strained their relationship. Dickinson appeared several times in the late 1960s and 70s, where she often leaned towards her sexy screen persona. Her flirtatious exchanges, playful glances, and suggestive one-liners were usually charming, but Carson sometimes appeared uncomfortable during their session on the show. At first, this was of no concern, but those moments of flustered hesitation became increasingly frequent, hinting at their unspoken dynamic. There were rumors that their chemistry dated back before Dickinson's Tonight Show visits. Though neither of them had confirmed what their relationship was, the occasional slip-ups and awkwardness sparked some interest. And so while Dickinson stayed graceful on air, those watching backstage sensed a history not fit for tonight's script. The underlying tension between them hit a turning point when Dickinson made an off-the-cuff joke that touched upon Carson's private life, revealing new information about his divorce from Joanne Copeland in 1963. She made a joke that didn't quite sit well with Carson, and immediately his face fell. He managed to hide it under a tight smile, but the ice had cracked, and everyone could see it. Meanwhile, the mood has completely turned sour backstage. Dickinson had arrived expecting banter, but instead she found Carson distant, and her scheduled follow-up appearance never aired. Although she was never officially banned, her next booking disappeared from the calendar, and their relationship followed suit. At the time, many conflicting perspectives emerged, and Dickinson later reflected on the incident in a memoir, where she described the joke as innocent fun and expressed sadness that it had changed everything. She believed Carson took it personally and hinted their history made him sensitive. On the other hand, Insiders suspected her joke had crossed his carefully drawn line and brought about an embarrassing exposure of his private life. While most people questioned why Carson let the moment derail such a friendship, Dickinson's loyal fans felt she was misunderstood and unfairly sidelined for a single remark. Nevertheless, for Carson, personality mattered almost as much as privacy, and Angie had just shown him that she could have some slip-ups. She continued to flourish in film and television, but she was never called back for an appearance on The Tonight Show. This wasn't drama or theatrics. It was just a small private moment that got exposed, a misstep that ruined a bond. Johnny valued charm and personality, but above all, what he treasured the most was control of his stage, his mood, and his persona. But Dickinson's unscripted comment had threatened that control. From October 1962 until May 1992, Johnny Carson was the undisputed face of late-night television. At its peak, the show drew in nearly 17 million viewers. Johnny was adored by millions of people worldwide, but also feared by a few. His brilliance was seen in his ability to make stars shine, but he also held strong editorial power. The guests who failed to impress him could be quietly cut out of the segment and sometimes excluded from future invites. Although many comedians and actors such as Seinfeld, Letterman, and Rivers credit their careers to his platform, a handful also found that falling out of favor with Carson could close doors indefinitely. What was it about Johnny Carson that made everyone who challenged him disappear? Which guest surprised you the most on this list? And do you think Johnny was right to cut them off? Have you ever watched a Carson clip that revealed a different side of him? Let us know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed watching this video, click like and subscribe, but before you go, click on the next video below.